Hi, I'm Rev Sarah Schlieckert, and I want to thank you for joining our video blog series as we prepare for the annual conference session of the Baltimore-Washington Conference, which will be happening next week in Baltimore. As we've been working through some basic information about the annual conference, today I want to share with you some thoughts on how the annual conference relates to the general conference. Now, in previous videos, you heard me explain that there's a couple different things that we mean when we say the annual conference. Often when we say the annual conference, we mean the organizational structure of the annual conference, or in a variety of ways, maybe the geographic area. And then there's another way that we mean annual conference, and by that we mean the annual conference session. So the meeting of the annual conference. That's what I'm going to talk about today. When we think of the annual conference and how it relates to the general conference, if we're talking organizationally, we might ask how the annual conference relates to the general church. And that's a whole different discussion. It's related to how those two meetings, those two sessions relate to each other. I've got a great metaphors out there, but today we're going to focus on how the annual conference session relates to the general conference, not the general church, which is the organizational structure of the denomination, but the general conference. You may know that the United Methodist Church is structured with three branches similar to the United States government. The executive, which would be our bishops, the episcopacy, our legislative, which are our conferences, the most powerful and the broadest of which is the General Conference, and the judicial. So that's represented by our judicial council. But those powers in the United Methodist Church aren't shared evenly. It really is our legislative bodies that hold the vast majority of power. For example, it's only the General Conference that can speak on behalf of the denomination. The General Conference does that primarily through in the way that it meets every 4 years. The General Conference meets in leap years, and so 2020 is our next General Conference, with the rare exception, as we had this year, of special call General Conferences, as we had in February in St. Louis. So the General Conference's work is represented in two books. The first is the Book of Discipline, and that holds all of the rules and policies for our denomination. The General Conference is the only body that can change or that can set things to the Book of Discipline. And all of those guide our work as United Methodist. The General Conference also issues the Book of Resolution. So that has statements about our views on a whole variety of issues, that expands on our social principles. Our social principles can be found in the Book of Discipline. And so these are the two sources of information about the work the General Conference has done. So the General Conference is the highest legislative body, but there are a number of layers of those legislative bodies. So let's look at those, and so we can think about how the annual conference relates to the General Conference. The most basic unit of legislative bodies in the denomination is our charge conference. Sometimes it's held as a church conference. And that means in our local congregations, there is a charge conference that's held annually at which certain official decisions are made. That charge conference is often in our annual conference held in the fall. And things like the pastor compensation needs to be approved at charge conference. The sale or purchase of property is also approved at charge conference. Charge conference is where our local church leaders are elected. And so that's the kind of the basic level of our legislative bodies. In some areas of the United Methodist Church, they use their district conferences. In our annual conference, that's not really an active part of our structure. And then charge conferences or local congregations elect at least one lay person to go as members to the annual conference session. All active clergy are part of that annual conference. Those who are ordained are also full members as deacon or elders. Local pastors go to the annual conference, and there's different levels of voting rights that different types of clergy have at the annual conference. But your local congregation sends one lay person, and depending on your membership, possibly more. Larger churches might have more, because representation at all of these levels is proportional once you get to the annual conferences and beyond. Now, so your local church sends folks to the annual conference, and the annual conference in turn sends persons to our jurisdictional and general conferences. And we do that by election. So representation at jurisdictional and general conferences is proportional to membership in local annual conferences. So one of the things that we will be doing, and one of the most important ways that our annual conference relates to general and jurisdictional conferences, is the election of delegates to go from our annual conference to vote and be part of the discussion and the discernment at general conference. This year, as it is the year before general conference, is the year that we'll be electing delegates. We elected equal number of clergy and lay delegates to general conference. Our jurisdictional delegates are just a doubling of that. So this year we'll be electing 6 clergy and 6 laity to serve as our delegates to general conference. That means then that our jurisdictional delegation will be made up of 12 clergy and 12 lay persons. And then we also elect several alternates in the case that any of those elected earlier are not able to serve. And so those persons serve our annual conference. They don't go. Our annual conference's delegation has not understood that those persons go splitting their votes the way that the conference might be split. And so where we try to get full broad representation of our annual conference is in the election of delegates, to try to make sure that the diversity of our annual conference is represented in that delegation. Those persons are elected by the annual conference by majority. So for a person to be elected, they have to receive more than 50% of the vote. Now, voting goes on for a long time. Sometimes those persons will kind of change the way and try to make that voting happen faster. But that is the primary way that our annual conference is connected to the general conference. Now, I mentioned the jurisdictional conference. So we kind of think of those conferences as layers, but the jurisdictional conference makes it a little bit fuzzy, because our annual conference relates directly to the general conference as well as directly to the jurisdictional conference. It's not as though our annual conference elects folks to the jurisdictional conference and then the jurisdictional conference sends delegates to the general conference. Our delegates go directly to the jurisdictional and directly to the general conference. We, as an annual conference, relate directly to each of those. Now, a jurisdictional conference is a regional collection of annual conferences within the United States. Outside of the United States, those conferences are called central conferences. We are part, as the Baltimore-Washington Conference, we are part of the Northeast jurisdiction, which includes the Baltimore-Washington Conference, the West Virginia Conference, and everything northeast of that. There are 5 jurisdictions within the United Methodist Church, and those jurisdictions and the central conferences have a variety of responsibilities. For us, two of the primary things that our jurisdictional conferences do is set the boundaries of annual conferences and elect bishops who are then assigned to episcopal areas that oversee annual conferences by the jurisdictional committee on the episcopacy. But the general conference is the place that our delegates go to be part of the discussions about all of those pieces that are part of our book of discipline and our book of resolutions. At the annual conference, we don't have the ability to change either of these documents, and so we're bound by the decisions of the general conference. And so anytime that an annual conference wants to have an impact on what is in the book of discipline or the book of resolutions, it has to happen through the work of the general conference. That happens both through the work and the vote and the discussion and the advocacy of our delegates to general conference, but also annual conferences as well as individuals can submit legislation to the general conference to be discussed and worked through and then to receive a vote either at the committee level or in the general session. The general conference is the place where, for example, and then represented in the book of discipline, that many of our basic policies are outlined. The annual conference, in some cases, can add requirements or can adapt a little bit for their work in their local annual conference, but they have to do that in ways that do not violate the Book of Discipline and the work of the General Conference. So an example of how our annual conference adds to some of the requirements of the Book of Discipline is in our ordination process. The Book of Discipline says that provisional members, provisional elders, or deacons must serve 2 years before they're eligible for ordination. The Baltimore-Washington Conference for a number of years has held that requirement at 3 years. So you can add to those requirements passed by the General Conference, but you can't subtract from. In fact, a lot of the church's debate and discussion recently around the special General Conference session and our ministry with LGBTQ persons has to do with those policies which the General Conference passes, which annual conferences and those clergy and lay persons and local churches who are part of annual conferences are then expected to uphold. So the General Conference is the place that our rules as a denomination are decided. And so as an annual conference, it's important that we are mindful of how we elect delegates and who we're electing. And as an annual conference, then we are bound to follow those policies of the General Conference and those things that are passed at the General Conference. And the way that we would seek to change the policies of the General Conference would be through submitting our own resolutions or supporting those resolutions that are brought by other annual conferences or by individuals. As we continue to work together, we'll see that there are lots of tensions within that system. And there are ways in which the straightforward explanation that the General Conference passes it, the annual conferences maintain it, and the local churches maintain it, it's not that simple. And it's not only around issues or questions of ministry with LGBTQ persons. There are many things in the Book of Discipline and in the Book of Resolutions that you may not even know, let alone be astutely following all the time. And so when we begin to talk about where the disconnect is between General Conference and our annual conference and local churches, there are many topics that we could include in conversation. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about the General Conference and some of its policies and what it's passed, you can check out the Book of Discipline. I don't have my 2016 on me, so this is the 2012. They change every 4 years. Each General Conference session, then a new Book of Discipline and Book of Resolutions are issued. And so those are some of the ways that we as the annual conference relate. The Book of Discipline outlines how our annual conference is structured, how our local churches are structured. As I mentioned, how what the minimum ordination requirements are, how we are called to be in service and ministry to the world, what our doctrinal standards are, who we are as United Methodists, both in our theology and in our polity and in our structure. So that work happens at the General Conference. The Book of Discipline says that annual conferences are the basic body in the church. The basic body in the church, and it's in the annual conference that not only do we elect delegates, it's the annual conference that would vote on constitutional amendments, and it's the annual conference that votes on, quote, all matters relating to the character and conference relations of its clergy members, and on the ordination of clergy and other such rights as have not been delegated to the General Conference. And in fact, the interpretation of that passage in the Book of Discipline is part of our discussion now around issues involving the ordination of LGBTQ persons in the United Methodist Church. So even as we have these statements, we continue to kind of work through how we interpret and how we apply that. That's some of the work that our Judicial Council helps in. If you have any other questions about the annual conference and the General Conference, please post them as comments and link, and myself or colleagues or other folks who are reading the comments might be able to help answer. In the next video or next videos that I'll do, I'll be posting more about what happens at the executive session of the clergy at annual conference, as well as I'll do a quick overview of our schedule for this year's annual conference session in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. Thanks, and I'll look forward to being with you again soon. Bye.